The kitchen clock read 10:17 p.m. as John pushed a stack of unopened envelopes across the scarred oak table and sat back, rubbing his temples. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the howling of a late winter wind. He had promised himself more times than he could count that prosperity would arrive the day his paycheck climbed, a future reward just out of reach. "When I make more, I'll finally breathe," he muttered, as if saying it aloud might make it true. His wife stirred from the living room couch, looked over and simply said, "You always say that." That small, honest sentence landed like a stone. John felt the familiar shame of dreams delayed, not because money wasn't possible, but because his thinking built invisible walls around it. Imagine this ordinary life. Steady work, careful spending, a closet of hopes hidden behind someday. The lamplight catches the dust motes and the calendar on the wall. Reminders of birthdays, mortgage due dates, and a vacation never taken. In the quiet, a different voice begins to speak. Not the one that counts pennies, but the one that asks, what if prosperity is more a way of thinking than a number in your bank? That question arrives slowly, like dawn, and it unsettles him. He remembers a conversation with an old colleague who said, "It's not how much you earn. It's how you imagine your life with what you have." John scoffs, then wonders. The doubt and the possibility sit side by side. This is where many of us stand, good people living good lives, hemmed in by beliefs that feel like facts. Tonight, though, a subtle shift begins. Curiosity replaces resignation. He opens one envelope, then another, not to tally losses but to notice patterns. He sketches a small plan on a napkin, a handful of modest experiments he can start next week. There is fear, yes, and relief too. The relief that comes when you stop waiting for a miracle and start rehearsing new choices. If this image of John stirs something in you, give it a quiet like, and tell us below. What is your biggest financial pain today? Subscribe if you want to walk the next step with him. Up ahead, his first real test appears, a decision that will show whether thinking differently can change everything. The scene opens on a kitchen table under the soft glow of a single lamp. Envelopes stacked in a neat but unforgiving pile. A calculator, a mug gone cold. John rubs his temples and repeats the same promise he's told himself for years. Once I earn more, everything will change. His wife moves around the room with gentle efficiency, folding laundry, the small clink of hangers punctuating the silence. You can feel the weight of ordinary life. Reliable routines, shrinking surprises, and a persistent whisper that prosperity is a future event, not a present possibility. That evening, a friend recommends a financial guide. Not the flashy kind with impossible guarantees, but a steady counselor who's helped people like John shift from stuck to steady. They meet in a small, sunlit coffee shop, the kind that smells of roasted beans and new pages. The guide looks at John with the calm of someone who's heard this story before. "Tell me what prosperity looks like to you," she asks. John lists numbers, raises, that mythical promotion. She leans forward and says something simple and disarming. "What if prosperity is less about a bigger paycheck and more about how you think and act with the money you already have?" At first, John bristles. "I don't even have enough to save," he says. The guide doesn't argue. Instead, she draws out a different map, habits over windfalls, identity over income. She describes ordinary shifts, making small automated allocations before the money fades away, treating expenses as choices that reflect values, and naming one reliable habit that creates momentum. She tells a quiet story of a teacher who started with $20 transfers and, 5 years later, had a rainy day buffer and the confidence to negotiate a better contract. The detail makes it believable, human, possible. Back home, John stands by the bills again, but something has changed. He opens a bank app and schedules a modest transfer, not because he has extra, but because he is deciding who his money will serve. The first tiny confirmation pings. It feels like a key turning in a lock. Hope arrives not as a fireworks splash, but as a steady light. If this resonates, tell us, what is your biggest financial pain today? Like if this strikes a chord, and if you want to follow John as he takes his next practical steps, consider subscribing. The real work starts in the next scene. John sat at the kitchen table as the morning light slanted through the blinds, scattering soft lines across unpaid bills and a faded notepad. The house smelled of coffee and the faint lemon of the dish soap he never got around to replacing. He rubbed his temples, listening to the familiar inner voice. When I earn more, I'll finally be free. Then the guide, calm, steady, a voice that felt like a hand on his shoulder, leaned in beside him and said, "Prosperity doesn't wait for a paycheck, John. It begins with the stories you tell about money." John blinked. "But I barely make enough to cover the basics," he muttered. The guide smiled without judgment. "Exactly why mindset matters. You're treating money like a scoreboard instead of a tool. Let me show you 3 small shifts." He pushed a pen across the table and drew nothing more than 3 arrows. Prioritize, plant, protect. Prioritize became a rule John could feel. Pay attention to how money flows before obsessing over how much comes in. The guide described a ritual, a 10-minute weekly review, where John would assign every dollar a job. The simplicity surprised him. There was dignity in saying out loud where money would go. Plant was the idea of microinvestments. A single dollar redirected to a tiny savings goal, a book on budgeting borrowed from the library, a conversation with a neighbor who sold handcrafted goods. The guide told stories of others who started with pocket change and grew habits steady as tree rings. John saw himself planting seeds rather than waiting for rain. Protect was not paranoia but a promise. Small safeguards, like an emergency envelope and a pause before impulse buys, that kept progress from unraveling. The guide leaned forward and said, "Think like the rich. Control what you can control. Build rules, not miracles." A skeptical laugh escaped John, then softened into curiosity. "What if I slip up?" "You will," the guide answered. "But slip-ups are data. The wealthy learn faster because they measure, iterate, and keep going." As the conversation ended, John felt a strange, buoyant steadiness. Hope was no longer a distant bonus. It was a practice. If this resonates, give a quiet like, and tell us, what is your biggest financial pain today? Subscribe if you want to follow John into the next chapter, where small choices meet real tests and the first clear victories begin to appear. Morning light slices through the curtains as John sits at the kitchen table, a stack of envelopes like a small, quiet mountain. The coffee has gone cold beside his hand. He had always imagined prosperity arriving as a single thunderbolt, a promotion, a windfall, but the phone call from his old friend and mentor, Elena, pulled him into a different story. "Prosperity isn't an event," she said over the park bench 2 days earlier. "It's a set of choices you make before the money arrives." That line stays with him now as he opens a bill and breathes slowly. The scene shifts back to that bench, Elena watching him with patient eyes. "What scares you most?" she asks. John stammers, "Running out. Letting my family down." She nods, then leans forward and paints a different picture. "Think like someone who manages abundance," she says softly. "Not because they already have it, but because they treat every dollar as a seed. Small habits, repeated." Her voice is steady, almost ceremonial. The words sound simple, but for John they feel revolutionary. We follow John as he tries those habits. He automates 2 small transfers to a savings account. The first deduction feels like a quiet promise. He negotiates a better phone plan and brings his lunch 3 days a week. Small rituals that stitch together. There's a moment of private shame when a credit card statement arrives, followed by a private triumph when he refuses the impulse purchase and uses that money to round up a savings goal. Elena teaches him to reframe risk. Instead of fearing loss, he evaluates opportunities as experiments with feedback. "If a wealthy person were in your shoes," she challenges gently, "what would they do first?" He imagines them trimming expenses, investing in a skill that earns more per hour, and building relationships that open doors. He calls his daughter to ask about her freelancing course and finds her offering a tip that saves him time and money. One evening, rain on the window, his wife Maria holds the envelope for a small emergency repair that the new fund just covered. She laughs, then cries, and John realizes the emotion isn't relief alone. It's a shift in identity. He is no longer waiting for prosperity to arrive. He is arranging the pieces so it can grow. The scene ends with a quiet resolve and Elena's voice in his head. Small, consistent choices become the architecture of wealth. If this resonates, tap like and tell us, what's your biggest financial pain today? Share below, and if you want to walk the next steps with John as he faces real setbacks, subscribe and stay with us to see how these new habits withstand life's tests. In the next part, John's progress meets resistance, and the real work of consolidation begins. John sat at his kitchen table as the late light softened against the curtains, bills spread like a weathered map. The guide had asked him to do something simple and radical. Name one belief that kept him stuck. He hesitated, then whispered to himself, I need more money before I can prosper. The guide's voice in his head was patient. What if prosperity begins with how you hold your money, not how much you earn? The question landed like a small stone, creating rings of possibility. Over the next weeks, the living room became his classroom. He learned to treat his paycheck like a team of workers, each dollar assigned a job. Essentials, savings, investment, joy. Felt strange at first, like learning a new language. When he automated his first small transfer to an investment account, he felt a pinch of fear and a surge of pride. That's only $50, he told his wife one evening. She smiled. It's 50 towards something different. That tiny, consistent choice began to change the cadence of their lives. The focus shifted from waiting for a raise to stewarding what they already had. The guide introduced tools that were more mindset than math. The habit of naming a spending decision before it happened, a ritual of gratitude when a bill was paid, and a daily minute to visualize being the kind of person who manages money calmly. John practiced saying, I invest in my future, even on a tight month, until the words felt less like wishful thinking and more like instruction. He sold forgotten items from the garage, negotiated a small freelance job, and, most unexpectedly, started teaching his teenage daughter a simple budget exercise over pancakes. Her laughter made the work feel human, not punitive. Resistance returned in quieter forms. Old shame, a panic at unexpected repairs, a voice that begged for immediate comfort. Each time John met those moments with a steady plan, a small buffer fund, a pause before impulse, he built proof that prosperity was a practice. He began to see progress in plain things. A growing emergency cushion, a monthly contribution that compounded, a new calm when the phone rang. Tell me, what is your biggest financial pain today? If this struck a chord, tap like and stay with us. Subscribe to follow John's next test, when an unforeseen crisis will reveal whether these new habits can hold under pressure. John sat at the kitchen table under the hum of the overhead light, a mug cooling beside a stack of old bills. The guide's voice, calm, certain, still echoed in his mind from their last meeting. We don't wait for a bigger paycheck to act, she had said, leaning forward as if sharing a private map. We change the way money thinks about us. He tried it that week. He labeled one small portion of his paycheck seed money and treated it like a guest he wanted to keep coming back. He stopped letting every impulse be the loudest voice in the room. At first the change was almost comically small. A lunch packed instead of eaten at the corner deli, a subscription canceled with a polite email. Yet those small refusals felt like tiny muscles waking up. It doesn't have to be dramatic, his wife murmured as she washed the dishes, watching him mark a simple savings goal on an app. Just consistent. They began talking differently about their choices. The word waste fell away. The word investment found its place in ordinary sentences. In the evenings, John would stand by the window and imagine his future self not as a distant stranger but as someone he could respect. Prudent, patient, and steady. Not everything went smoothly. A car repair bill threatened to undo a week's progress, and old doubts crept back in like rain through an unfinished roof. You can't buy your way out of doubt, the guide told him once, hands folded. But you can out-habit it. So he met the setback with a plan. A temporary cutback, a renegotiated payment, a small side project using skills he'd been ignoring. Each action was less about sacrifice and more about deliberate allocation of attention. Along the way, John learned the mental model the guide offered. Treat income as a tool, not a mirror of self-worth. Separate wants into experiments and commitments. build optionality, even in small fractions. Friends noticed the calm in him. Neighbors asked what had changed. If this steady progress resonates, give this video a like and tell me in the comments. What's your biggest financial pain right now? Subscribe if you want more practical steps taught with the same human wisdom. Just as he began to taste the first real momentum, a larger crossroads appeared. A decision that would test whether he had truly started to think like the prosperous. The kitchen smelled of coffee and late autumn air as John spread his bills across the table, the lamplight carving shadows between his fingers and the paper. Across from him sat the guide, not a lecturer, but someone who had sat in those same chairs, who knew the tiredness in John's voice. "You promised yourself you'd prosper when the paycheck grew," the guide said softly. "What if prosperity starts the day you rearrange how you think about every dollar?" John laughed, a small, skeptical sound. "Even with what I make?" "Especially with it," came the answer. "The rich don't always earn more. They think differently about the money they already have. They worked like craftsmen." The guide asked John to name one recurring expense that felt like permission rather than purpose. They traced a month of small leaks. Subscriptions never used, impulse dinners, a habit of treating stress with spending. Rather than shame, the guide offered a tool. A small, repeatable system that fit John's life. Pay yourself first with a modest automatic transfer. Treat savings as a bill, not a leftover. Reframe spending as votes for the life you want. Build a buffer of 3 modest months, then let that buffer breed choices. "We're not waiting for a raise," the guide reminded him. "We're building habits that will get the raise of compounding time." Scenes shifted over days. John setting up automated transfers late at night, the hush of his phone confirming each move. His wife smiling at the sight of a tiny emergency stash. A neighbor's car breaking down and John handing over a repair bill without panic for the first time in years. The internal voice that once said, "I can't," softened into "How can I?" He cut one and used subscription and redirected that small sum monthly into a micro-investment account. He tracked results like a gardener watches seedlings. Patiently, with steady hands. There were stumbles. A weekend sale tempted him. He paused, picturing the buffer in his account, the freedom it represented, and chose differently. The guide's words stayed with him. Prosperity is created by a consistent operating system, not a single lucky event. If this resonates, tap like. It helps us know this guidance matters. What is your biggest financial pain today? Share it below. Your struggle might be someone else's turning point. If you want to keep walking this path with John, subscribe and come back for the next step. He's about to make a choice that will either test his new habits or prove them true. The kitchen light haloed the papers on John's table as rain tapped a steady rhythm against the window. He stared at numbers that once felt like verdicts. Across from him, his voice, calmer now, because he had learned to listen to something other than panic, said what the financial guide had taught him. Money answers the questions you ask of it. He remembered the guide's soft, steady voice in the workshop. Think like the rich. They design decisions before money arrives. You can do the same with what you already have. John folded a receipt and smiled, surprised at the smallness of his own courage. He began to speak aloud the new questions. Which bill am I prioritizing that builds security? Where can I trade habit for intention? The answers were practical and plain. He automated a portion of his paycheck to a separate account labeled emergency, set a calendar reminder to review subscriptions, called his insurance company, and negotiated a margin back into his budget. Each tiny action read like a vote for the life he wanted. There were stumbles. One evening he held a new jacket in a store and felt the old tug, comfort in an immediate reward. He closed his fist, remembered the guide's counsel. Wealth is created in the quiet discipline of small choices. He left the jacket and, on the walk home, felt lighter, not deprived. At home, his partner kissed his forehead and said, "You look different." It wasn't new income they celebrated but a change of posture. Calmer, intentional, expectant. As days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged. John stopped treating money as unpredictable weather and began to build systems. A buffer to soften storms, a habit of investing time in learning, and a network of practical mentors he could call when stuck. The mental model became clearer. Those who stagnate react. Those who prosper design. It wasn't magic. It was practice, repeated. When his emergency fund reached the modest goal he'd set, $1,000, painfully humble and proudly his, he didn't shout. He sat in the chair by the window, feeling something else. Confidence braided with patience. If this resonates, tap like and tell me below. What is your biggest financial pain today? Stay with us. Next, we'll turn these small wins into a steady engine of growth and uncover the traps that can undo progress. The room is quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft scratch of John's pen on a sheet of paper. Evening light spills across his kitchen table, illuminating a small stack of envelopes, a laptop with one spreadsheet open and a sticky note that reads, "Small wins compound." He remembers the old promise, earn more, then prosper, and now hears his mentor's calm voice in his head. Prosperity is a skill, not a salary. That line lands like a key in a lock. He begins to act. He doesn't wait for a raise. He starts with what he has. John sets up a weekly money date, 15 minutes every Sunday to review, adjust, celebrate progress. He automates a tiny transfer. $25 moves to a separate account the day his paycheck arrives. It feels almost ridiculous until, weeks later, that account holds $300 and he realizes the cushion is real. He renegotiates his internet plan, bundles a couple of subscriptions, and sells one item he never used. Not as sacrifice, but as clearing space for what matters. Each choice is framed as an experiment. If I try this for 30 days, what happens? He learns to ask, to call, to compare, skills that cost time, not a higher salary. There are stumbles. A car repair arrives like a storm and the old fear returns. But the small buffer steadies him. He handles it without panic. He begins to speak differently about money at the dinner table, modeling phrases like, "I choose where my money goes," instead of, "I can't afford." His partner notices the change in tone and the steadier posture. Neighbors ask how he seems more relaxed. John simply shrugs and says, "I stopped waiting for permission to prosper." The mentor appears again in memory, quieter now. Think like the rich even if you earn little. Focus on control, margin, and learning. Those three anchors become his toolkit. Control through automation and budgets, margin through intentional trimming of waste, learning through small, consistent investments in knowledge. If this resonates, tap like and share. What is your biggest financial pain today? Tell us in the comments. Your question might be the turning point. Join us for the final step, where John cements these habits into identity and we reveal the long-term blueprint that turns steady progress into lasting prosperity. The kitchen light is soft as dusk settles outside. John pushes his mug aside and looks at the small stack of papers he once feared. They no longer feel like a sentence. He remembers the night he first met his guide, a quiet voice that asked him to see money not as a judge but as a tool. "What if you could think like the rich without waiting for a raise?" the guide had said. That question became a lantern. Now, months later, John closes his eyes and feels the steady pulse of new habits. A budget that honors his priorities. A tiny emergency cushion that keeps panic at bay. A weekly 30-minute ritual where he reviews goals, not guilt. You see him standing on the doorstep of ordinary life. Mortgage, aging parents, hopes for retirement. Yet different. The difference is not his paycheck. It is a reshaped interior landscape. He chose curiosity over shame, delayed a few wants to fund small investments in himself, and began treating each dollar as an expression of intention. There were setbacks, an unexpected car repair, a day of doubt. But each time John returned to the simple questions the guide taught him. What does this expense buy me? Does this move me closer to the life I want? The answers rewired his choices. Listen to how the room breathes around him. Laughter from an online class he finally dared to take. The calm of a spreadsheet that reflects real values. The pride in a voice that can say, "We're steady," instead of "We're stuck." Prosperity, he learned, is less about abundance and more about clarity, consistency, and courage. It grows from small, repeated acts, setting boundaries, investing in skills, automating savings, and finding community that reinforces growth. If John's turning point touched you, give this video a gentle like and tell us in the comments. What is your biggest financial pain right now? Share one small step you could try this week. If you want guided steps to build your own steady progress, subscribe. There's more practical, calm guidance ahead to help you turn intention into lasting prosperity.